Well, this is another of those occasions when the morning and the evening fit together rather remarkably well. I do like it when that happens. It seems to me that the Lord's hand is in the preaching. I want you, first of all, to turn to Proverbs chapter 3, just for a moment. This is a verse that I wanted to use as a text, and it so happens that Stephen quoted it this morning. But Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 5. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. Now the significance of those two verses is that is exactly what David did not do. So it's a sort of reverse text, if you like. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart. David's trust, he was a godly man, but he was wavering. Lean not unto thine own understanding. He was trying to sort out his problem, as we shall see, by his own intellect and scheming. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. And yet he ended up in the cave of Adullam. So with that behind us, what we're going to see tonight is what happens to the child of God who doesn't heed this instruction. Proverbs 3, verses 5 and 6. We're going to see what happens when we don't do what is enjoined upon us there. Now, to understand what's going on in this passage, we need to remind ourselves of what's happened earlier on. We need to set it in context. And it's really particularly chapter 19. You remember that in chapter 19, Saul had tried to kill David. He'd thrown a spear at him. If you look at chapter 19, you'll find there how it was that he took a spear, and he threw it at David. Well, that night, David went home to his wife, Michal, who was, of course, Saul's daughter, so he was son-in-law to King Saul. And she lowered him out of the window, and he was able to escape. She later blamed him for his escape, but that's beside the point. He escaped. David escaped, and he fled to Samuel, who was in Ramah. And again, you find that in chapter 19 and verse 18. So David fled and escaped and came to Samuel to Ramah and told him all that Saul had done unto him. And Samuel went to dwell in Naioth. So the two of them, David and Samuel, had gone to dwell in Naioth. And as that chapter continues, we find that Saul heard that they were together in Naioth. And so he sent men to abduct, possibly kill immediately David. He sent these men to catch David. And as they approached Naioth, they found that something really quite remarkable was happening. Because it seemed that the Spirit of the Lord had come down upon those people there in Naioth, and they were prophesying. And these men who'd been sent to arrest David, it came upon them. And they were just taken up with this presence of the Spirit. They were unable to do anything about arresting the man that they'd come to fetch. And so it was that David sent a second group of men to arrest him. And they failed. And he sent a third group, and they failed to arrest him. Verse 20, Saul sent messengers to take David. And when they saw the company of the prophets prophesying, and Saul standing as appointed over them, the Spirit of God was upon the messengers of Saul, and they prophesied. And when he was told Saul, he sent other messengers, and they prophesied likewise. And Saul sent messengers again, the third time, and they prophesied also. And then we find that Saul decided to go in person. Verse 22, then went he also to Ramah and came to a great well that is at Sechu, and asked and said, where is Samuel and David? And one said, behold, they be at Naioth in Ramah. And he went thither to Naioth in Ramah, and the Spirit of God was upon him also. And he went on and prophesied until he came out to Naioth in Ramah. David, in the previous chapter, was in a remarkable place. He feared for his life, and he'd gone to Samuel. Together they'd gone to Naioth, and God, it would seem, was protecting him. The Spirit of the Lord was upon that place. Today we might say it was a revival or something like that. The Spirit of the Lord was upon it. No one could touch either Samuel or David. That's the situation that David was in when we come to our passage here in chapter 20. And so David had fled from a place of blessing, a place where God's Spirit was at work, and there was worship going on. No one could approach him. God, it would seem, had fenced him about. But David had left that. And our passage begins, we find him going to consult with a well-qualified friend that he has. Someone who would really know what's going on. And if you look at chapter 20, and at the end of verse 3, you'll see what was on David's mind. He tells Jonathan, there is but a step between me and death. He's fearing for his life. Remember, he'd been in Naioth. The presence of the Lord was there. No one could approach him or Samuel. And he'd left that situation because he wasn't sure. What is Saul going to do? Yes, I know that the Lord seems to have him captured at the moment, but what's going to happen? What is in Saul's heart? And so our reading begins with David having left that place of protection and blessing and come to consult with Jonathan. Now remember that Jonathan was Saul's son, and therefore a well-placed friend to Saul, to David, to find out what was in Saul's heart. Surely he would know what was in Saul's heart. And so it is that we find our passage begins with David having left that place of blessing and come and sought to find out what was going on in Saul's heart. But I do remind you that David was a God-fearing, God-honouring young man. If you go back to 1 Samuel chapter 17, to his conflict with Goliath, look at what he says in chapter 17, verse 45. As Goliath approaches with all his armour and his weapons, then said David to the Philistine, thou comest to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. He's coming in that confidence. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee and take thine head from thee, and I will give it to the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day, to the fowls of the air, the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. David was a bold, God-fearing young man. But you see, faith is wavering. Faith is wavering. He's got this worry. What's Saul going to do? And he's convinced, as it says at the end of verse 3, he's just a step away from death. That's how dangerous he feels his situation to be. And that's why he leaves the place where God was protecting him, to try and find out, to try and engineer a situation, to try and work out his own preservation for himself. So, with that in mind, that background, we're going to divide that long passage that I read into 4 sections. First of all, David shares his problems with Jonathan, well-placed informant. And that really takes up the whole of chapter 20. And then secondly, first 10 verses of chapter 21, we're going to talk about David at Nob. And then verses 10 to at the end of that chapter 21, David at Gath. And then the first 5 verses of chapter 22, David at Adullam, the cave of Adullam. What we're going to see is a downgrade. You've heard of the downgrade, haven't you? We've got David trying harder and harder, engineering his own safety all the time, walking further away from the Lord. And remember, he's a God-fearing young man. So there's a lesson here for all of us as believers. This is what happens when we allow worry, that's what David had, when we allow worry to interfere with our trust in the Lord. What was that verse? Trust in the Lord with all thy heart and lean not to thine own understanding. We're going to trace how David's undoubted trust in the Lord begins to waver because he's preoccupied with his own understanding, what he can engineer, what he can do to achieve his own guarantee of safety. So then let's begin. David is consulting first of all with Jonathan. And we look at verse 1 of chapter 20. David fled from Naioth, fled from the place of God's blessing and presence. David fled from Naioth in Ramah and came and said before Jonathan, "What have I done? What is mine iniquity? What is my sin before thy father, that he seeketh my life?" Now, Christian, have you been there? Something happens, and haven't you said, "Oh, what have I done to deserve this? Why now, Lord? Why this, Lord?" That's what David's doing. It's quite common. I'm sure that you'll have been in that sort of situation. David fled from Naioth to Ramah and came and said before Jonathan, "What have I done? What is mine iniquity? And what is mine sin before thy father, that he seeketh my life?" He's desperate. Now I need to say just a word about this friendship between David and Jonathan. In these days, and I'm sorry about this, ladies, but in these days, ladies were not regarded very highly. If you read Greek history, you find that this sort of friendship is very common, because if a man wanted someone who's going to be a support, a good counselor, someone you could rely upon, he would obviously choose another man, because the ladies were regarded as frail creatures, incapable of such support. It's very common in Greek literature, and that's what we see here. Other people have tried to put other constructions on it, but that's a fact of history. So here we've got David. He's got a good friend, Jonathan. He trusts him. And this man, Jonathan, he's a godly young man too, as we're going to see. But he's also the son of Saul, so who better to consult? That's David's mindset as he tries to engineer his own safety. Who better could I consult than Jonathan, my friend Jonathan, the very son of the king? He'll tell me what's going on. But I want you to notice something else. Look at verse 4 of chapter 20. Then said Jonathan unto David, "Whatsoever thy soul desireth, I will even do it for thee." Now remember that Jonathan is Saul's son. In the normal course of events, Jonathan could expect to be the king. But he knew that his friend David had been anointed by Samuel. So however much Jonathan helped David to get ahead, to achieve his safety, was at his own cost. David's promotion was Jonathan's demotion. You see what a gracious young man Jonathan was. Read that verse again. Jonathan said unto David, "Whatsoever thy soul desireth, I will do it for thee." He's willing to help David to achieve the throne, even though he might have had it. Whether some accident that destroyed David, he would have been on the throne. But he knows that the Lord has anointed David. And so he's prepared to support David, taking his own place as heir to the throne. That's the sort of man that Jonathan was. And so David has left this place of blessing, left Naioth and Samuel the prophet, trying to engineer his own safety. And he comes and he seeks out Jonathan and he asks, what am I to do? What's the situation? What is your father's plan about this? And Jonathan signs up to help him. Jonathan is willing to do whatever it is that David is desiring. And so Jonathan and David together, they set a test. The test is that David would be absent from the forthcoming meals for the next 3 days. You remember that earlier on, when Saul had his demon possession, David had been brought in to live there in the palace because he was a good player of the harp. And so he was expected to be there at the meal tables. And he was going to be missing for the next 3 days. And Jonathan was to watch and see how his father reacted at the absence of David. And you notice that it's David who concocts this rather doubtful test. Tell your father that I've gone to Bethlehem to a family feast. I've been called by my brother. I've got to go to this family feast. That's why I won't be at the table. Not really true. But you see, this is the way it's going. As David goes further on this downgrade, further from the Lord, he's now engineering a situation based upon half-truths. But then Jonathan agrees to go along with this. But then the question is, well, how can Jonathan tell David the answer? Because if Saul is intending evil towards David, then surely it would be dangerous for Jonathan to meet David again, because someone might be following Jonathan, and that would give away David's hiding place. And so they have this charade with the little lad with the arrows and shooting the arrows, and in the instructions that Jonathan gave to the lad, David, listening from the bushes, the trees, wherever he was hiding, he would understand it was a message to him. You're safe to come out, or you must flee, you must go. But in return, Jonathan asks for a favor. And that favor is that when David comes to the throne, he will protect Jonathan's house and his family. And that's a very real issue, because very often in those days, when a new king came to the throne, he would destroy all the relations of the previous king, just to ensure that he was safely upon the throne. So it was a reasonable question for him to make. And so in verses 16 and 17 of chapter 20, we read this. So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, let the Lord even require at the hand of David's enemies. And Jonathan caused David to swear again, because he loved him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul. They'd sworn between them that they would support each other. When David came to the throne, he'd look after Jonathan. There'd be no vindictiveness to him or to his family. But notice, this is an initiative that Jonathan makes. It's he who brings the Lord in to this conversation. It's he who suggests that there should be this solemn covenant before the Lord, not David. His mind is on other things. His mind is on how he can save his own skin, how he can get away from Saul. And so they make that covenant. And David then waits for the result of this test. And the result, of course, is that Jonathan discovers that Saul is indeed still intending to destroy David. Indeed, Saul becomes so angry with Jonathan that he tries to kill his own son. And in the process, he maligns his own wife and Jonathan's mother. But that's the sort of man that Saul was. And so the message is delivered to David, and we close that chapter with verse 42. Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for as much as we have sworn, both of us, to the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord be between me and thee, between my seed and thy seed forever." And he rose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. And this is almost the last time that Jonathan and David were ever to meet again. But notice, again, it's Jonathan who's bringing that sort of godly influence into their relationship, because David's in a bad place spiritually. This is, you see, the result. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart. Lean not to thine own understanding. David is wavering in his trust. He feels he needs to employ his own understanding to save his own soul. And so they part. And we come now to this question: what would David do now? He knows that Saul is engaged against him. So he decides to go to Nob. And this is the first 10 verses of chapter 21. Why did he go to Nob? We're not told why he went to Nob. But at Nob there was the tabernacle, and there was Ahimelech, the priest. The Ark of the Covenant wasn't there because that was still at Kirjath Jearim, you remember, from an earlier chapter. But at least there is a priest there, and there is the tabernacle. We're not told why David went there, but later on, next time, later in chapter 22, we shall discover that Saul accuses Ahimelech the priest of having sought guidance from the Lord for David, what he should do. And the priest denies it, so we believe the priest, but it might have been what impelled David to go there. We don't know, but it might have been that he was seeking guidance from the priest. But the trouble was that as soon as he appeared, verse 1 of chapter 21, the priest was immediately suspicious. Then came David to Nob, to Ahimelech, the priest, and Ahimelech was afraid at the meeting of David, and said unto him, "Why art thou alone, and no man with thee?" David was a known leader and warrior, the king's son-in-law. Why has he come on his own? Why has he come like this? And he's suspicious. And David feels he can't reveal anything. And so now we find David taking another step down. He resorts to outright lies now. He says, the king has given me a secret mission. I can't tell anybody about it. Can't tell anybody. And as for the people you say that should be with me, I'm meeting them later. I just want some bread. I've left in such a hurry. And you remember we read together about the way that he took the bread, and then he wanted a weapon. And Ahimelech the priest says, well, the only weapon we've got here is Goliath's sword, the man that you killed. And David is pleased. There's no sword, he says, no sword like that. And so he's able to leave the priest here at Nob, not having obtained any guidance about the future, but he's got some bread and he's got a sword. He's got Goliath's sword. So now we come to the question, where would David go next? We continue in the downgrade. The next brilliant idea is that he would go to Gath. He would go to Gath. Gath was a Philistine city, full of Philistines. And he was David. And pretty immediately when he gets there, we find people saying, but don't you remember? People used to sing songs about this man. Saul has killed his thousands, David's killed his 10,000s, and most of those 10,000 were our Philistine people. This is what the Philistines were saying. What's this man doing here? He's the slayer of Philistines. And remember that he arrives wearing Goliath's sword. And Goliath came from Gath. So there in Gath, there would be living his friends and his relations. And here was David, the man who'd killed their hero, their giant. And he expected to be safe. You see where his own thinking is getting him. It's yet another foolish step. He's gone a step deeper. Remember, he started off in Naioth. The Lord was protecting him. The Spirit came upon people. Messengers coming to arrest him couldn't do it. They were overpowered by that sense of the Lord's presence. Taken up in prophecy. 3 lots of them. Then Saul himself. David had left that situation. And step by step, now he expects to be safe. Safe from Saul amongst the Philistines. Oh, he thought, Saul will never look for me amongst the Philistines. Of course not. It's a foolish place to go. And there he was. And there was more or less a revolt. We don't want this man here. And indeed, the only way that that David could ever escape safely from Gath was to pretend to have lost his mind, to allow his spittle to drip down upon his beard, to claw at the doorposts. And so doing that, he was able to get out safely, out of Gath. What's he going to do next? Where would he go next? And we find chapter 22, verses 1 to 5. He goes to the cave of Adullam with the malcontents, the disillusioned. Verse 2 of chapter 22. Everyone that was in distress, everyone that was in doubt, in debt, everyone that was discontented, gathered themselves unto him, and he became a captain over them. And there were with him about 400 men. What a journey he's been on. Here he is, with a down and outs. But God is about to rescue him. God is about to rescue him. That's the astonishing thing. He turned his back upon God in Naioth. He tried to save his own skin with a succession of lies. He's made foolish decisions. And yet, God is going to rescue him. If you look at verse 5, the prophet Gad said unto David, pause at that point. Amongst these people, there had come the prophet Gad. Now, in all of Israel, Gad was second only to Samuel. He was that distinguished a prophet. We're going to see, as we go on in this book, much more about Gad. He's going to be instrumental in David's future. And here amongst the people who'd come to this cave full of dropouts, there was the prophet, second only to Samuel in Israel. And God sends this man to give David counsel. Isn't God amazing? Isn't the mercy astonishing? After David had made step after step away from Naioth, away from that place where the Spirit was so evidently at work, down amongst the dropouts, God is willing to send a man. Do you remember what that man says? The prophet Gad said unto David, "Abide not in the hole," that is, in the cave of Adullam, that's what it was called. "Abide not in the cave of Adullam. Depart and get thee into the land of Judah." Go back to the Lord's people, David. This is not the place for you. And you notice that that's what David does. He departed and came into the forest of Hareth. And this is the beginning of the restoration of David that we shall hear about. It's a long, it's a painful, it's a tortuous restoration we shall hear about in the following weeks. But isn't God good? In all our foolishness, he rescues us. It's the story of the gospel. It's the story of sinners. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, a world full of sin, a world that had turned its back upon God, gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth on him should not perish, but have everlasting life. As God gave his Son, so here he sends the prophet Gad, and he says to David, get out of this place. Go back to Judah. Go back to the people of God.